Okay, so Pete Heskett, welcome to Over the Board. It's really lovely to meet you.
Thank you, Ed. Very good to be here. I'm a fan of the podcast, so it's always nice to be involved with something that you've been listening to as a listener. Yeah.
Well, thanks for saying so. It's always nice to meet people who are listen to the show, and I'm actually really enjoying kind of jumping back into it at the moment and meeting new people and doing more interviews. I really enjoyed my break, and I really needed a break because I was doing a lot last year. But yeah, I feel refreshed. Apart from the fact that, as I said before, it's 8 o'clock in the morning here. I feel as refreshed as you can do at 8 o'clock in the morning and ready to go. So, I wanted to, talk to you in detail about ADHD today, and that's one, reason why I first reached out to you. And I'll mention, I think a post of yours that drew my attention. But as with all my guests, I like to spend some time getting to know you first. And I think especially in these conversations, sometimes if I'm asked to speak as an autistic person, I like to emphasize that while that's a huge part of my life, well, it's everything in my life. It's also not, the single thing that defines me. So if we could
Yeah.
start, just where are you from? Are you based in London?
Yes, so I live in London, live in South London, in a place called Herne Hill, not far from Brixton.
Mhm.
I'm not originally from London, so I was born in Coventry, then we moved to Sheffield, then we moved to Kent. So I've moved
Oh,
around a lot as a kid, but yeah,
okay,
London's where I've kind of settled. I've also traveled a lot internationally, so I
sure.
spent 8 years in Asia, 3 years in Shanghai, and 5 years in Singapore
Oh,
before
fantastic.
returning to the UK in 2013.
Yeah. Was that through work or family, or
Yeah,
what's inspired your
yeah. So I
travels?
I worked in advertising for 30 years.
Hmm.
And yeah, in my early 30s, I got an offer to go and help set up um, a sort of a well-known UK ad agency
Hmm.
in China. It was very, very big, kind of exciting move to make with two young children. But yeah, we packed up our things and went to China, had an amazing time there for 3 years, and then moved to Singapore.
Wow.
Um, and then, yeah, decided to come back in 2013.
Okay. And London's a huge, sprawling place, so this is a slightly more difficult question than I sometimes ask my guests. I asked to, tell us a little bit about your local backgammon scene. I don't know if you want to define
But
your little corner of London, or talk about
yeah,
London more generally.
well, that's the thing. I guess if you were to call it local, it doesn't feel very local to me because there's not really
Hmm,
much going on in my, within sort of 1 or 2 miles from where I live. So, I mean,
sure.
I attend a club in North London, um, at the Clissold Arms in East Finchley, run by the very, very great Aydin Kolchak. So
Hmm.
that's my kind of local club, but it takes about an hour and 10 minutes for me to get there, so it doesn't feel particularly local.
No.
Um, and then, yeah, but only recently, about a year ago, these events started in London called Backgammon and Wax as well, which is
Yes.
something set up by a couple of guys who are sort of combining, DJing in kind of
Hmm.
pubs and members clubs and that sort of stuff, so
Who I will
listen
be
to
interviewing
music
in a
as well
couple of
as
weeks,
playing
by the
backgammon.
way. So
Ah, excellent. Yeah, no, they're lovely guys. So,
good.
yeah, I've been going to a few of their events recently, I think it's just brought something lovely and refreshing to the London backgammon scene.
Hmm.
It's attracting a younger, more diverse crowd to it. So, yeah, that's been a really, really positive thing that's happened here.
Fantastic. And I wanted to ask about your introduction to the game as well. And you told me a little bit about this in a message you sent me. Could you explain that for our listeners, and the role that Tavley played in your backgammon learning journey?
Yeah, so I mean, I was first introduced to the game on a holiday in Turkey, but it was really when I met my partner Melanie that
Mm,
my interest in backgammon took off because her father, originally from Australia, had relocated to Greece and was living there with his fourth wife and kids.
mm,
And they had a holiday home on the island of Thassos, which is sort of in northern Greece. Um, so we would go there pretty much every year for family holidays. It's a beautiful island, amazing beaches,
yeah.
but the evenings would always involve having to play my father-in-law at backgammon. And we played the Greek version, which is without the doubling cube, and you play three games. So the
Mm,
backgammon that we know, I guess I don't really want to call it normal backgammon, but the one that we know is the
sure.
first of those games. But you play them, in turn.
Okay.
So yeah, that was my introduction to the game. And after many years of him sort of just beating me and I mean, you know, for the first few years, you have to put up with it because obviously you're trying to get in with the family, you know, establish yourself and that sort of thing. But after a while, after that sort of, you know, introductory phase was over, yeah, I wanted to sort of, you know, I wanted to improve my game so I could win a few against him.
Good.
So yeah, that's where I guess my interest in the game started. And then I started, you know, I bought a book. I started playing online a little bit. But it was only really during lockdown about 5 or 6 years ago that my
Mm.
interest in the game really sort of peaked. So, you know, I was a casual player, I guess, for the last 25, 30 years. But it was only really, yeah, 5, 6 years ago that things really sort of took off for me with lockdown
Yeah.
and all that time that we had on our hands.
Well,
And
it's
yeah, I mean,
interesting, I think,
basically, yeah,
and
sorry.
perhaps not surprising how often lockdown comes up in these conversations. You know, people have spoken about lockdown projects that have turned into, you know, pieces of backgammon software or has turned into a
Yeah.
book or, you know, yeah. So, oh, sorry, I was going to lose my train of thought this morning. Sorry. Anyway,
That's
I just
okay. I mean,
interrupted you
I
to
actually,
share my little insight about lockdown. So, do you remember where you were up to?
yeah, no, I actually think it's interesting. You know, I mean, look, there was lots of, it was, you know, lots of difficult things, I guess, about that whole period for people. And I don't know, man, I always felt quite privileged because I've got a home, I've got a family. So for me during lockdown, you know, I had company, I had people around. Whereas, you know, in the agency I was working in, you know, we had
Mm.
younger people who were stuck in share flats and that sort of thing, you know, estranged from others. So yeah, I guess it was different for different people. But I do think it was actually quite a creative time in many
Mm.
respects, you know. The big disruption that we all had to our routines, and yeah, for me, I don't know. I guess it sort of started with playing backgammon online a bit more, and then it was the UBC final between Mochi and Ueda was the thing that really
Yeah.
kind of caught my interest. So, I mean, first of all, that was an amazing match where both players just played insanely well, and I guess it had a great sort of narrative arc to it because Ueda was the challenger. You know, the guy had only really played the game for I think about 3 years at that point. And was beating Mochi to start with, and then Mochi, you know, the seasoned pro, came back and took victory in the end. So there was that, but also I think the broadcast done by Mel Colson, Nick Blazier, and the guests that they had on it
Mm.
was great. You know, it was really. I mean, you know, the rest of my family were watching with me, who are nowhere near as obsessed with backgammon as I am. So yeah, I just think it was a wonderful. You know, in this sort of like dark time, I guess that we were having,
Yeah.
that was this wonderful moment for backgammon. So I guess showcase the game at its very, very best, that it could be this mind sport, that it's not just a game of luck and, you know, whoever rolls the best. I mean, obviously that is a big part of the game, but,
Sure.
you know, I think those two players really gave about the best account that's possible to give of the game in a public forum. So yeah, I mean, I was hooked by that, and then it just sort of snowballed from there. You know, I started playing more. I took lessons with a number of
Mm.
teachers, and then started playing in tournaments, both online and over the board. And yeah, I mean, really, I guess from a backgammon perspective, it's been a bit of a whirlwind for me because I've gone from playing about 10 PR, I think I was when I first started playing on Heroes
Mm.
in 2020 to now being a member of the UK team. I've represented the UK at the last three World Teams Championships.
Fantastic.
I made Grandmaster last year and very quickly went from G3 to G2. And won a number of tournaments as well. So yeah, it's really sort of yeah, it's amazing really. I guess at this stage of life, so I'm in my early 50s.
Yeah.
It's weird to have something come in and you sort of feel like that's the phase of life where things should be slowing down. Whereas for me, in backgammon terms, everything's just sped up, which is great.
That's
It's good to
fantastic.
have things, yeah,
Yeah.
to keep us going and keep us interested.
And to the point at which you turned pro last year, is that right?
That's
Um,
right. Yeah. So,
what does that
um,
mean for you, and how big a decision like was that? That's like that means you're not working in advertising anymore entirely,
yeah,
or
yes,
wow.
yes, exactly. So I've given that up, and I took I sort of left the agency I was working with. I worked with them for like 6 years
Mm.
in the early summer, and I decided to take a few months off to sort of, see how I was feeling and what I wanted to do in, direction I wanted to go in my life. And I went to the World Championships in Monte Carlo. That was for me a really big experience. It was kind of, a bucket list thing to do.
Mm.
I played really well over there, and I managed to get to the final of the senior, so I cashed as well.
Yeah,
That was overall a really successful trip. And then, I met someone there who was like, "Oh, do you give lessons?" Um, and yeah, I guess I extended my sort of, well, I'll see what I'm doing for another couple of months. And then I picked up more students. I went to more tournaments.
hmm
And, I guess I decided that at this stage in life, I wanted something new to sort of focus on as opposed to something I'd done for 30 years. And I felt in a
sure.
way kind of tired and, lacking challenges in anymore.
Yeah,
And backgammon, I think, is one of the great things about it as a game is there are lots of endless challenges, I guess, with it in terms of either understanding it or learning how to communicate it to others, or winning tournaments and competing and that sort of thing.
sure.
Um, yeah,
Well, I'd like to ask you about that idea of learning to communicate ideas in backgammon as well, because you talked about taking lessons yourself and now becoming a
yeah,
teacher. Do you? I often find it interesting to talk to teachers because clearly being a high level backgammon player and having all that content knowledge is really important, but that doesn't automatically make someone a good teacher. From lessons
Mhm.
that you had, were there things that stood out to you as what is good teaching, and do you have anything particular in your approach that you like to bring to your students?
Yeah. I mean, gosh, there's a lot to cover there. I mean, I had lessons with four teachers, with Phil Simborg first,
Oh
then Julian
yes.
Fetterline, who's a British Grandmaster, then Tim Cross, who's another British Grandmaster, and then finally Seb Wilkinson, who's probably the strongest player in the UK. Um, and I kind of feel like I learned different things from each of them.
Mm,
Phil very much sort of. I guess he really helped establish the basics. Like there was the first lesson we did. He sort of showed me all the possible roles that you can have,
mhm.
with two dice. And I played this game for 30 years, and I was like, oh my God, I've never even thought about. Every time you roll the dice, there's
Yeah,
these 21 different variables, and obviously 36 outcomes in total.
yeah,
I'd never, it seems so obvious, but I'd never thought about it like that. And yeah, Phil really helped put in some foundations. Julian is a great theorist of the game. And again, taught me a lot about sort of different positions. Tim was an amazing coach. He had a very different approach. Julian would have a lot of content, whereas
mhm,
Tim's approach to teaching was you'd play and you would talk. And yeah, Tim, I think in a way he's like a coach in the true sense of the word, in terms of he's not just talking to you about you know cube decisions and checker play and that sort of thing. He's talking about how you approach the game, your rhythm,
mm,
your mindset, all that sort of stuff. Um, and then with Seb, I would say, Seb, I always talk about him as my finishing school. So I hadn't made Grandmaster before I worked with Seb. I was playing, I guess, around, I don't know, between 4 and 5, 4.5
mhm.
sort of average. And Seb's tutelage really helped me to get to the higher level. And I think Seb's understanding of the game is, I would say, unparalleled. His conceptual understanding of the game is just
Mm,
so rich and deep, and very much in my own teaching, I guess, working from the foundations that really he has given me.
yeah,
But to come back to your point then about kind of communicating ideas, I think one of the interesting things in my job. So in advertising, I was working in strategy.
mhm,
And first of all, I think backgammon is actually a very strategic game. The first thing you need to do in any situation on the backgammon board is to be thinking about what are your objectives, where am I trying to get to, how can I get there, etc.
yeah,
What sort of game am I in, and therefore, what in a way, out of the possible outcomes of the dice, how should I be then thinking about what I need to do there? So yeah, that's an important part of it, and I think that's helped me a lot with the game. But I also think, so in my job, I spent a lot of time making presentations. Like my job as a strategist in advertising was presenting and selling ideas to people.
yeah,
Um, So I've probably created over 1 million PowerPoint slides in my career. Stood up and talked about them a lot. And as I said, it's about communicating ideas and using data and all that sort of stuff. So, in my teaching, actually, I mean, I felt, in terms of the materials, with no disrespect to any of the people that I worked with, but I felt like the materials that people use could also be optimized further. So I create slides often for the teaching lessons that I do. I think my aptitude for creating and presenting ideas and data has helped me a lot as a teacher. I think there's lots of other things that can make you a good teacher. I think you have to understand that people are all different, that they all have different learning styles, and different ways in which you can kind of like motivate them and help them to grow and learn. So, that was quite a revelation, I think, for me with this, because I've never really done any teaching before. And you just kind of assume with something like teaching that everyone's going to be like you, and if you say the things that stimulated you, that all of a sudden, whereas I do think, that, as I said, for me, that's been a big thing that I've had to come to terms with as a coach and a teacher is just how different people are, and how, in a way, you need to, your content and your materials can be transferable. But I guess the way in which you communicate those and the things that you put emphasis on and what you're trying to help people to sort of see and understand, and that needs to be tuned to your audience, like a good ad,
Yeah, sure. And speaking of Seb as well, I think you told me you and he are writing a book. Is that right? How far along is that project, and what's the idea behind the book? What's the focus?
So, the book is it's a very ambitious area of backgammon that we're taking on. So, the book is about backgames and about backgame strategy, which is one of the most challenging areas of the game. And it has its genesis in a couple of lessons that Seb, one of the things that I went to him about, and one of the areas where I felt I was making mistakes a lot was in back games. And if you're committed to trying to get the kind of BMAB grades in backgammon, you become very sensitive to back games, because you can play, like 3 PR in an 11-point match, and then suddenly, a triple anchor back game can come along and you can lose, double the equity that you lost in the whole match in that one game, and it can cause real wreckage. So, this was an experience that I had, and I went to him. I felt like this was one of the roadblocks that I had, and he prepared a couple of lessons, for me on that, and it's from that material, I guess, which is the sort of the foundation for the book. But also, I guess the point was that, it's interesting. When I first started playing backgammon, I used to love backgame because I felt like it was a really interesting way to outplay your opponent. And then, when the BMAB thing came in, I started to hate them because they're so easy to make huge errors in. And now I've kind of come full circle. I'm back in love with backgames, thanks to, I guess, the stuff that I've learned with Seb. And that was really, I guess, the idea for the book, was that this is in a way a nice story for us to share with the world about, about this journey that both of us went on with back games. But it's a tricky topic, and it's a very deep topic. And I guess the thing that we've had to be mindful of is to be sort of choiceful about what we try and cover within it, because, you could probably write 10 volumes on all the different variations of things that can come up in back games alone. So, the projects, I guess we're about halfway through the writing process, but then we'll have the editing and production process as well. So hopefully, it's something that will be available this year. But it's been a lot of fun. Seb's a great person to work with. And I'm really, the material that we've created so far feels really good. So very much looking forward to sharing with everyone.
Fabulous. Point. Well, stay in touch and let us know when that's coming out. Just one more question about that though as well. I'm curious. I'm terrible at back games. They're an exciting thing to play. I know for a fact I have a lot to learn. Do you think? You talked about the possibility for complexity in that topic to spread over several volumes. Is it the sort of area that can be distilled down to some general principles that can apply to a back game, if there's such thing as a back game, or is it you have to learn, double anchor, you have to learn triple anchor, you have to learn these two anchors. Like, I don't know, is that something you're able to explain?
Yeah, I mean, I without sort of um, fully going into a promo for the book,
Yeah, of
I
course.
do think that's what's nice about what we've tried to do is that we've tried to identify, you know, the core principles of play for both the back player, because you know, like when you're playing a back game, it's not just the person playing the back game that has a difficult time; it's the person who's playing against the back game. You
Yeah.
know, what we call the forward player.
Mm,
To make that distinction, and yeah, I think for both, I mean, essentially, the thing that is at the heart of a back game is a battle for timing, really.
mm,
And then there are many sort of, I guess, ways in which you can try and manipulate timing to try and create the sort of positive strategic outcomes that, you know, that either the back player is looking for or the forward player is looking for. But the thing with back games, I think that's difficult, particularly difficult for people, is two things. Like one is they're very long,
mm.
and actually the critical moment can be, you know, 30 or 40 moves down the line. So you have to stay very concentrated, you
Yeah.
know, on the detail for you know, essentially for that to be ready for when that critical moment occurs. And then I think the other thing that's very difficult for people is that, um, you know, you know, show Stranger Things where they have like the upside down. I
Yes,
always
yeah.
talk about backgammon as being like the upside down of
Mm.
backgammon, because so many of the rules of what you're supposed to do are the opposite
Yeah.
when you're playing a back game for both players. You know,
Yeah.
and it's I think people find adjusting to that very very difficult.
Mm,
Um, you know, most of us are pattern recognition based with a game, habit based. You know, we like to sort
mm.
of play a little bit on autopilot, I think, and I think back games are really, really challenging from that point of view.
Oh,
But
sounds fascinating.
it's a fun topic, you know, and
Yeah.
they're very fun to play. So yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'd like to switch now and start talking about ADHD. And
Hmm.
you know, ADHD and autism are very different things, although they, you know, co-occur a lot more frequently than was thought in sort of in decades past. And you know, there are several people in my life who have ADHD diagnoses, but I really wanted to ask you, if you're happy to do so, to just
Sure.
explain in general terms to people who are not familiar, you know, what is ADHD?
Okay. Well, I don't know if I'm going to give you a scientifically correct
No, and that's fine. Just
explanation of this.
from your personal perspective.
Well, I mean, I someone did explain it to me as being about dopamine in the brain,
Hmm.
and you know, dopamine is one of the chemicals in the brain which is, you know, leads to good feeling. It's also one of the chemicals in the brain which is linked to sort of decision making and that kind of stuff. But apparently, ADHD people have either, you know, either their brain doesn't produce enough dopamine or it's not very good at absorbing it. So
Hmm.
essentially, it's a deficit of dopamine in the brain. Um, and that then leads to both attention deficit, because if an activity isn't giving you dopamine, then you know you zone out very quickly and you lose interest. And it also explains the hyperactivity aspect, because you know people will try and create dopamine through a physical activity or doing something, you know,
Hmm.
unexpected or extreme or whatever. So yeah, I mean that's my understanding, and that, to be honest, that explanation makes a lot of sense to me. I've always been someone who, you know, my experience at school was like I was like really really good at some subjects which I liked, and then at other
Hmm.
things which I wasn't interested in, I'd do really badly. I was very, you know, I was very sort of polar,
Yeah.
I guess, in terms of yeah, my experience of education. And yeah, I mean, from a very early age, I'd get like really deeply obsessed by things. Like when my this is, you know, it's funny that a lot of these come back to games as well. So my dad bought me a Napoleonic war game when I was about 9 or 10 years old for Christmas,
Hmm.
and that like spawned this obsession with Napoleonic history. So at the age of like 12 or 13, you know, I just go to like the library, like read all these like, you know, serious like academic books about
Yeah.
about Napoleonic history at this really nerdy early age, right? And I
Brilliant.
reckon at the age of like 12 or 13, I was probably, you know, in the top 100 people in the world of understanding Napoleonic history. So yeah, and then so then obviously puberty happened, and it became music and electric guitars
Hmm.
and things like that. Um, and then the rave scene, DJing, and that sort of stuff. And yeah, I've always, cooking has always been a big obsession for me.
Hmm.
Um, it's all of these activities which are very like video gaming. I love it. So these things which are like very immersive and which you can kind of lose yourself in and get into that flow state with. And
Yeah.
I think that's linked. I think that's linked to ADHD because people say that ADHD is not just having poor attention. The flip side is that if an activity gives you dopamine, it leads to hyperfocus,
Hmm.
which actually means you can be really good at things. You've just got to find those things which engage you and keep your attention. And then I think from my understanding, I guess we live in a world which is designed for neurotypical people, not for people who are neurodiverse.
Hmm.
And I just think for me, I think that a lot of the issues that people with ADHD tend to have is because they end up being round pegs in square holes. They just haven't
Yeah.
found their job or their hobby or their activity or whatever, which allows them to I guess use their talents and their brain for the things that it's good at.
And we'll talk in a moment about the links between some of the things you just mentioned and to backgammon. But I was curious to ask as well, because like me, I think you were diagnosed fairly late in life.
Yes, yeah.
What were the circumstances that led you to seek a diagnosis, and what was that
So,
process, or what was that experience like?
it's quite funny actually. So my middle son Arlo, at the age of 16, the kids, nowadays they're all tuned into sort of like neurodiversity because of social media has I think
Yeah.
brought those things to people's attention a lot more. And there's tests you can do online and that sort of stuff. So
Sure.
so he at the age of 16 sort of diagnosis, and so we put him through a process there. His therapist, he got diagnosed as quite strongly ADHD.
Hmm.
Um, and through that process, the therapist was like, "Okay, so tell me a little bit about your parents, because this thing's hereditary." And he started. I told him a little bit about myself and Mel.
Yeah.
And when me working in advertising came up, the therapist said, "Oh, you do know that nearly everyone working in advertising is undiagnosed ADHD." And then when it came to sort of like describing some of the symptoms, everyone in the family this all happened during lockdown as well, was sort of
Yeah.
looking around the table at me. So yeah, I mean, it's something. I guess it's really weird because I'd never been aware of it. I mean, I think most people often have a sense that they're a bit different, but I don't know whether that's related to neurodiversity or whatever. I guess I'd always had a bit of a sense of that, and I'd always struggled. I've suffered with things like insomnia for years throughout my life, which is a big issue for ADHD people. I
Yes.
I kind of have like mental hyperactivity more than physical hyperactivity. Um, but yeah, so when Arlo got diagnosed, the ability to get diagnosed was offered through my work at the time. So
Hmm.
I went through the process, and I mean, when they sent back the kind of report, which was sort of had diagnosed me formally and was talking about my symptoms and everything. I mean, I was quite shocked, to be honest, Ed. I was really like this, without going into too much detail. It was just describing how I was like constantly fidgeting, constantly like losing focus. I mean, I felt like I must have been like the rudest person on earth, and it made you feel like, God, am I like that with everyone in real life?
Can be
So yeah, I mean, it
confronting
was
seeing it written down in
yeah,
that sort of way.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, very confronting. And I mean, it was funny because through that process, there was like a therapy group that happened after that.
Hmm.
And it was at that point that I realized actually how lucky I had been, to be honest, to have, found advertising.
Hmm.
Um, I've been able to like bring up a family and pay a mortgage, because a lot of the people in the group that I was in they were struggling. I mean, for me, I guess there's there's been lots of issues now that I can look back and I
Yeah.
can see how ADHD has maybe held me back in certain situations. But the people in this group, were really having some problems, and that's where this thing about I just kind of you could just see with these people. There was a guy who was working as an IT help desk person.
Mm.
It's just like if you're ADHD, that must be just a nightmare. Have
Incredible
all these
challenge. Yeah.
things like coming in
Yeah.
at once that you have to deal with. Whereas advertising, it's like, oh, can you come up with lots of ideas? It's like great. That's like perfect for ADHD people.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it was an interesting thing to go through, and I guess for me, I'm very happy I did seek the diagnosis because I think I understand myself a bit
Mm.
better now. And to be honest, it's made
I can
things
relate
like
to
this
that.
decision, yeah, to sort of focus on backgammon a lot
Yeah.
easier because I just think this is a bit more me.
Yeah.
It's something which I love. I enjoy doing. And yeah, I mean, being involved with something that you're passionate about is exactly what ADHD people need, I think. So.
Sure. Well, coming back to backgammon then as well, with the potential for inattention, with the potential for kind of hyper focus, how do you think that
Mm.
has, looking back now, with you sort of armed with this new knowledge, do you see kind of connections between ADHD and backgammon and uh, almost nailed that question, Pete, and I ran out of steam right at the end. Yeah, how do ADHD and backgammon combine in your life?
Mm. I mean, I feel sometimes that people talk about, they go, oh, ADHD is not, a problem. It's a superpower and all this. I think that I don't really like that kind of way of talking about things because I think it's unfair. It puts pressure on people
Yeah.
who've already got, the problem of being neurodiverse in a world that's not really built for you,
Mm.
that there's now you have to be a superhuman, with your ADHD. So I
Yeah.
don't really like that way of thinking about it, but I do
It's
think,
problematic, isn't it?
yeah, I think it's really
Yeah.
problematic that. But I do actually think in my case, I for sure get hyper focused with backgammon.
Mm.
Like I played some matches today. I played one match, like 8 game, 7 point match, where I played like a 1.2 PR, and I was just in the zone. Just
Mm.
everything was tuned in, was focused, was happening. I was feeling everything, clearly, was connected to everything that was happening in the game. And I don't know, I'm struggling for language to kind of describe this because it's not a very languageful thing that I'm trying to talk about. It's a very emotional, inner sort of
Yeah.
experience, I guess. But for sure, with me, I can get that with backgammon. And when you're in that sort of situation, I actually think, in some ways, that's an asset.
Mm.
It's an ability, I guess, to concentrate and be connected to this thing in a deep, a deep way. But for sure, the inattention thing can happen as well. So, I mean, I kind of feel like um, my PR still now probably they have a bigger spread
Mm.
than other players. Like I can play to a really, really, low PR level, but I can also just like chuck some really bad PRs as well. And maybe it's things that afflict everyone, like sometimes when you're tired or if you're feeling emotional and
Yeah.
that sort of stuff. But for sure, I mean, I played a match actually recently in Gibraltar against Dagfinn Snarheim. It's obviously, super strong player, Norwegian G1.
Okay.
So we played in the Super Jackpot, and there was a cube that I sent. I can't remember, this was like 3 away, 2 away, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Dagfinn, it was a really big moment in the match. And
Yeah.
Dagfinn took about 4 minutes to think about this because he had like tons of time on his clock. And I just like completely tuned out in that time. I was expecting him to make like a quick decision, but in that 4 minutes, I just like,
Mm.
started looking around the room. I started looking at my phone, and then when he took the cube, because I thought he might pass it, I'm taking that
Yeah.
long. When he took the cube, I was like, oh, and rolled the dice, and then immediately made a blunder that was like
Mm.
a super obvious play, and just missed it because I zoned out at that
Yeah.
moment, and the attention that had been very strong had just waned completely. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't ever really want to use ADHD as an excuse for playing poorly. But I do,
Mm.
I see both sides of it a little bit. I see the side that can really help you be, very connected and engaged with the
Yeah.
game, but at the same time, and also, little distractions and that sort of things happening in the room if you're playing in tournaments or people coming around, sitting by the table or whatever. All
Mm.
of that stuff, I guess I'm probably very sensitive to
Sure.
to that, I feel. Um,
Well, we'll talk about that in a moment as well, because I'd like to get your opinions on, um, how welcoming tournaments and clubs can be to neurodiverse players. But just before I do, just to come back to the idea of attention and kind of tools to improve that, because I think the first time I reached out to you was a conversation about the use of headphones and music. Could you tell us again, just sort of personally, like when you use headphones when you're playing backgammon, and to what extent
yeah.
that helps as an aid for attention?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm playing in a tournament, any serious tournament or a BMAP, whatever, I really like to. I mean, I've got these Apple, headphones with like super strong noise cancelling,
Mm.
um, and for me, I think actually there's two reasons why it's helpful. I think one, the in a way the isolation of external noise out of your you know, field of concentration is really, really important for me. So
Hmm.
removing all of the other things that are going on, I'm one of these people, like if I'm in a restaurant, I find it really difficult often to talk to the people that I'm sitting opposite because of all the noise going on in the room.
Yeah.
Like that's a very ADHD thing. Like I just find it, I'm super sensitive to that sort of stuff. So,
Mm.
so the isolation, is really helpful. But then, to be honest, listening to music is super helpful for me. I'm a musician.
Mm.
I've made music. I play instruments. I'm a massive music lover, and I think music helps to get the dopamine going for me. And I've had some. This sounds like really cheesy and silly, but I've had moments where peak moments in my backgammon career where particular pieces of music have been playing, and those are actually really, really kind of like sort of special. I don't know how to. Yeah, I feel a bit funny talking about this, but like when I won the UK Open, there was a particular song that was playing, and the lyrics of that song felt like they were talking to me about the game. And then there was another
Wow.
experience I had during a BMAP where it's the first BMAP where I played like a super low PR, and in the final match, and I won the game, but I knew I'd played. Sorry, the match. I knew I'd played really well, and the final sort of game when everything, I was just sort of rolling this guy off the board. Um, there was another piece of music which was just capturing that emotion, and so
Mm.
yeah, I mean, in a way, I think music really helps me to feel in the zone and to feel good. I mean, sometimes if like a really like banging tune comes on or
Yeah.
whatever, I've noticed that sometimes I can be a bit impulsive and overly aggressive. So sometimes you have to keep it in check a little bit. I mean, I know some people like to listen to like rain, the sound of rain falling and things like that as sort of like a
Sure.
white noise thing.
Yeah.
But I like music personally, and yeah, it's both helps me to feel good, and I think it's also the soundtracking these moments, which are important and good to us. Like some people criticize people who wear headphones. They say, "Well, you're not engaging in the social part of the game," and and I think it's a valid criticism, and I'm
Mm.
not an antisocial person. I'm a very sociable person, so
Yeah.
I don't want to be antisocial, but I know that for me to perform at my best, an isolation of external kind of distraction and in a way, yeah, using music as a both a sort of a way to feel good and also a soundtrack to these moments and experiences that you're having over the board is something I both value and enjoy.
Well, I think that's incredibly interesting, the way you talk about music, and something I'd not really thought about before. It makes me curious, though. Do you have a playlist? Is it always the same things? Have you curated your ideal
No,
background
I mean
tracks?
I used to work on Apple. That was one of the
Mm.
the campaigns that I worked on. I worked on the original launch of the iPod.
Mm.
And Steve Jobs used to say, "Shuffle is God." In a way that only Steve Jobs could say and probably get away with, given that he invented it. you know, you invented the thing that's God, you must be God as well. But yeah, I have to say, I think he might be right. So sometimes I have playlists, but mostly I just listen to shuffle. And I love, in the same way as, I don't know, I'm obsessed, I play a game which is all about randomness. Like you never know what's going
Yeah.
to turn up when you roll the dice, unless you've got some special thing going on up here. And in the same way, I like the way that there is a serendipity between the music that comes up and the moment that's happening on the board. And I love it when those two things sync together. Now, sometimes, because I have very diverse music taste, like a particular track will come on that won't be helpful, but there's this thing called fast forward, which is very helpful for moments like that.
Oh, very good. Well, let's we're coming towards the end of our conversation now, but the next thing is something I really want to talk to you about, and that's about how the backgammon community is doing at welcoming neurodiverse players, and anything we can do to improve. I mean, in general, I find the backgammon community to be an incredibly welcoming place. And, aware that I'm a, white 50-year-old male who is heavily represented in that group, so that might not be the case for everyone. But,
Sure.
Simply from, personal experience, I think any potential disadvantage or barriers or hurdles that neurodiverse players might face is because of, a lack of understanding. And you and I grew up not knowing anything really about autism and ADHD, and why would you if you hadn't had personal experience of it? But including, I suppose, things like conversations about should headphones be allowed or not, and in your experience, how welcoming have clubs and tournaments been, and do you think there's anything we can do, even if it's what we're doing right now, having this conversation, to make those places and those events more accessible to people with a neurodiverse profile?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, for all of us, awareness is the start of understanding and all that kind of thing. But I don't know, Ed. My reading, I'm going to go a little bit like my son's therapist now, but I'm pretty sure that 70 to 80% of people playing backgammon regularly are on the spectrum at some point.
I think that's very likely to be true.
So, I mean, I feel like I'm amongst my people,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting question, but I have to say, I mean, I never, I guess for me, my journey of getting diagnosed coincided with my backgammon journey. And I don't know, I never felt that I was made to feel unwelcome in any way, shape or form. Yet, as you say, backgammon's been a very welcoming environment. I guess for me, I feel like maybe the challenges for backgammon are maybe in other areas beyond neurodiversity. But I would say that first of all, backgammon is a great thing to do if you are neurodiverse. For all the reasons that we've talked about. I think for both people with autism or ADHD, I think it's a great thing to be involved in. But yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like maybe in some of these areas, there could be a bit more tolerance for things like headphones and that sort of stuff. But I don't know, when I read the online debates, I just think all online debates are, they're just designed to be fractious in a way. That environment is designed to get people banging heads against each other, isn't it? So I think the reality in a way is very different from what you might read on a Facebook post. Most clubs
100%.
are very accommodating and very, very generous, very tolerant places for people of all types, and I'm sure, like any community, backgammon could always do better in some areas. But yeah, I think in general, I've found it a very receptive place to be ADHD.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. I was looking for some research in sort of recent months. I found an interesting article that talked about autism and ADHD and board games more generally, and levels of participation, and how people like you and me might be overrepresented is not the right term, but very welcome and fit very well in those sorts of scenes. So I might extend this conversation to other gaming communities and see if I can find out if there's at least anecdotally we can find the same sort of link. All right, Pete. Well, it's been fantastic talking to you today. You have spoken incredibly eloquently about so many interesting topics. I'm so glad, although it was a bit random just reaching out and say, hey, I noticed you said this about headphones. Do you want to talk to me? I'm so glad that I did. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Ed. My pleasure. Thank you, and yeah, good luck with the with this episode and everything you do with the podcast. As I said, I'm a big fan, and I always like to listen to the stuff that you produce. So yeah, I think it's a great thing that you're doing for the backgammon community. So thank you, and best of luck with it in the future. And I hope to meet you over the board at some point.
Yes, one day. That would be great. All right. Thanks, Pete.